It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Buongiorno tutti. Hello, everyone. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled Phil Ferguson Show. This is show number 211, and we have a lot to cover. First of all, we are going to talk about a little bit of an issue that I talked about last week with stock market returns and the Great Depression. We're going to get to that in a minute, and right after that, we're going to talk about Donald Trump and Republicans want to change your 401k. And then we're going to have a kind of longer discussion about the cushion. That seems to be the number one thing people want me to talk about. I've talked about it in the past. I'll talk about it again in the future. It's a very important part of the overall strategy, philosophy of how I do things. So people want to know more information about it. So we're going to go over that a little bit. But first, we're going to go back and look at stock market returns. And I had pointed out that I had found an article, and I think it was reasonably true, and we talked about this last show, so I'm not going to give you all the details, that when you count dividends and inflation or deflation in the late 1929-30 era, the stock market did not take 25 years to recover, as is often reported. It took 25 years to get back to the same price point, which ignores all the dividends, and it also ignores the deflation. And when you put those factors in, it took 4.5 years to make your money back. Well, someone wrote and said, Phil, well, what if I ignore deflation? How long did it take? And I'm like, well, that's a really good question. So it depends on when you start. So if you look at the amount of money you had in the beginning of 1929, so January 1st, 1929. Oh, and by the way, I am looking at data I found from the New York University Stern College of Business. They have a spreadsheet, and they have estimated S&P 500 returns all the way back to 1928. The reason I say estimated, the S&P 500 as an actual index did not exist that far back. But this is meant to represent what those 500 companies would be. So this is a better reflection of the Dow, which is what took 25 years to get back to the same price point. But again, if you start from the beginning of 1929, by the end of 1936, you were back to even. So let's see, that's going to be, yes, great radio, 8 years. So 8 years, and then unfortunately, in 37, the market went down again, but then in 38, it went up. In 39, it went down for a couple of years. So it was a rough stretch. But if you had a diversified portfolio, if you had some stocks and bonds, because some of the 10-year bonds during that time frame were paying 5, 8, 9, 10%. So just as an example, in 1930, when the market went down about 25%, the 10-year T-bonds paid 4.5%. In 32, when the market went down 8.6%, the T-bills paid almost 9%. In 34, the market was down 1%, and the T-bills paid 8%. So you had chances to make money, but if you were 100% in the stock market, which is why it's often good to have money in bonds if they're paying a reasonable yield. Now, when you look at the 40s and even the 50s, up until 1960, a lot of the times the annual return on bonds is really, really small. And I think we're entering another one of those eras where the bond returns are generally going to be very, very small. But that then leads to the question. So, but when you look at rolling 10 years, I'm sorry, I jump around. The only time that the rolling 10 years had a negative return were 37, 38, and 39. because of what had happened the previous 10 years. And then it waits all the way till 2008 and 2009, where you have a period where you could have lost money in the stock market over 10 years. So it's a pretty good track record. It's not quite 100 years of data, but there's only 5 years, and it comprises two different sets of data, 10 years after the Great Depression and after the dot-com and the real estate bubble. And even in the modern one from 2000, 2001, 2002 to 2008, you actually had a chance where you could have made your money back before it went down again in 2008. So at the beginning of the year 2000, the amount of money you had then, if you left it all in the market, which is what I recommend, you would have it all back by the year 2006. And 2006 was up 15.6, and 2007 was up 5.5. So you still had time to make adjustments in there. And of course, that was a period of time where I also would generally recommend some people have long-term bonds, which had some really successful returns. So even if you're in retirement, a generous portion of your money can be in the stock market for the long run. I was talking to someone and told them they were quite amazed by this, that my dad, up until his death at the age of 81, had 90% of his money in the stock market and only about 10% in what I would call the cushion. And someone recently said, okay, Phil, well, what is the right percentage to have in the cushion? And I don't do it that way. Some people will say 10% in the cushion, like my dad had, is very aggressive. Some other people, matter of fact, one of the guys that I listen to from time to time is called Bob Brinker. He's had a podcast, or not podcast, a radio show for, 25, 30 years. And he recommends in retirement, 50% of your money should be in the cushion. And if you have a 3% return in the cushion and 10% theoretically in the stock market, that's going to give you a 6.5% overall return, which is not bad, and it's a very nice and safe and conservative number. But can you make 7 or 7.5 or 8 or 8.5, maybe even more in the long run? And so the cushion size doesn't depend on a fixed percentage, although that can be easily calculated. But I do it based on how much money you need. So as an example, I'll talk about my parents. They lived on a very modest budget in their retirement. And my dad had Social Security. My mom had Social Security. And up until the last year or two of his life, my dad had a job working at Kmart in his 70s. Now, he had the luxury of being a greeter at Kmart by choice, because he, like I, or I like him, I like to talk. So it shouldn't be any surprise that he likes to talk. And, they were paying him good money, and he didn't have to be there. Now, he also would tell me a story about a guy that when they cut his hours was concerned he couldn't pay his gas bill or his electric bill. Well, that's stressful. That's not how you want your retirement to be. That's why we talk about saving money when you're young, 20, 30, 40 years old. You need to save money. And people know that I call 10% the suck-ass minimum. You want to shoot for 20%. But if you're starting to save when you're in your mid-50s and you want to retire at 65 or 70, it might have to be a whole lot more than that unless you have some kind of regular income. So for my parents, because he had a little bit of pension. He worked at AT&T for 25 plus years. Social Security, my mom had Social Security. All that money came up to cover a good percentage of their expenses every month and every year. So the amount of money they needed out of the portfolio wasn't very big. So let me give you a mathematical example. If you have $1 million portfolio, you could take out around $50,000 a year as a guideline, a rule of thumb. That's 5%. 4%, like many other things I talk about, it all depends. 4% is a very conservative number. And if you take out 4%, it's very easy for your portfolio to grow over time if it's invested wisely, 4%. Taking out 5% is a little more risky. But again, if you have a reasonable chunk in stocks and a balance in bonds, and sometimes bonds pay higher dividends than they do now, and they probably will again in the future. Making 5% is reasonably doable over the long run. 6% starts to get a little dicey. 6%, you run the risk that you have a period of time where stocks fall a lot and maybe bonds don't have good returns, and you have to start cutting into the meat of your portfolio. However, if you are retiring at 70, 6% is probably not too risky. I've had people come to me that are retiring at 72 or 75, and we talk about them taking out 7, maybe even 8% of their portfolio. And if you take out 8% of your portfolio and make no money, it will last about 12 years. So if you're retiring at 80, you'll go broke at 92. However, if you're taking out 8% and you're making 6% a year, you fall a little short the first years, but then you get more and more short as your portfolio shrinks. You may go broke by 100 or 20 years later. But if you're 80, something like 1% or less than 1% of the population makes it to the age of 100, maybe 7 or 8% is the right amount for you. But it also depends. A lot of people expect to, plan to, want to leave generous portfolios behind for their children or for some charity. So that all changes. But back to our example of $1 million taking out $50,000, or being able to take out $50,000. If you take out the whole $50,000, well, then you have to have a more reasonable, larger part of your portfolio to be in the cushion. Now, what percentage of your portfolio? Again, it doesn't work that way. So we start with the simple mathematics is that if you need $50,000 a year, the way your portfolio, the cushion can cover you for 10 years, clearly it's very simple mathematics. If you have $500,000 in bonds, then you can take out $50,000 a year and be able to do that for 10 years. Pretty straightforward. However, like pretty much everything, it's never that simple. So you could take out the bonds, you could sell the bonds, but you're forgetting about dividends. And right now, bond dividends are relatively low. With a reasonable mix of different types of bonds, you could make 3% pretty conservatively, pretty reasonably. And that's the point of the cushion, to be conservative. It's one of the things I tell people on a regular basis. If you have a bond fund right now that is paying over 5 or even over 6% or more, you need to find out why. You are probably taking on some serious risks that you may not understand. Back to the cushion. So if $500,000 of your money is in bonds and they're paying 3% dividends, that's $15,000 in dividends. If the other $500,000 is in the stock market, and it right now has about 2% dividends, and sometimes in the past it's 3 or 4, and even much higher 100 years ago, but let's use modern numbers. Let's use 2%. That's going to give you about $10,000 in dividends. So what you do is you have all of these index funds that are stocks and bonds. They pay the dividends to cash because you're using the cushion for retirement. So it's going to generate about $25,000 in cash flow. So now you only need to sell $25,000 in bonds if the market goes down. So you don't need 50% of your money in bonds. That might suggest 25% of your money in bonds. But of course, if more of your money is in the stock market, it has a lower dividend than the bonds. So it messes up that calculation a little bit, which is why I have a complex spreadsheet that kind of helps figure that out for you. The other thing is, of course, I recommend 10 to 12 years of cushion because it creates a little more drag or a slightly lower return in your portfolio, but it provides you a little more comfort, and some people are different. If you happen to be someone like my parents were, where they didn't need much money out of the portfolio at all, and if you can flex and in a given year just not even take out money at all, your cushion can be smaller. If the vast majority of your income is coming from your portfolio in retirement, you might want the cushion to be a little longer. So I normally recommend 10 to 12 years. And right now, since January 1st of 2017, I am suggesting that the cushion be +1. So the normal recommendation is 10 to 12 years, and you'll hear me say that all the time. Right now, I'm saying 11 to 13 years. And it has nothing to do with Trump although he scares the shit out of me. But it has more to do with the fact that the stock market has gone up 8-9 years in a row. So if you are in retirement or 12 years or less from retirement, a small step towards being slightly more conservative is not unreasonable to do. If you are 30 or 40 or even 50, anyone that's 12 years or more from retirement, you should not have a cushion. Now, that's in my opinion, and there will be lots of people that disagree with me and suggest that we should have far more money held in bonds. I think not at this time. When long-term bonds get back to paying 7 or 8% dividends, we'll talk, and maybe my opinions will change. But right now, if you're in the long-term growth phase and you're not close to retirement, why make 3% with your money when you could make 10%? But you have to keep in mind, next year we could lose 25 or 30%. Not a prediction. It just can happen. So something to keep in mind. So, the right amount that's in the cushion depends on your cash flow. It depends on how much money you need out of the portfolio. It depends on your other sources of income. And you must keep in mind what amount of money those dividends can create. And if we're in a time where bonds are paying 5, 6, 7%, and they're good, solid, safe, secure bonds, the portion of your portfolio that needs to be in the cushion can actually shrink because you're getting more money from the dividends. And then we've talked about in the past what is in the cushion. People want to know that. First of all, it's index funds, and I really like Vanguard index funds, although I'm pretty sure you can do the same thing at Fidelity and maybe even some other large brokerage firms or mutual fund companies. They have seen the success that Vanguard has had with index funds, and more of them have index funds. So if you find really low-cost, high-quality index funds somewhere else, you don't necessarily have to use Vanguard. But I'm going to have the money in short-term government bonds, short-term corporate bonds, Ginnie Mae portfolio, which is home loans. I know, home loans 2008, but they behave a little bit differently than high-quality bonds, but they pay a nice dividend. At least they do historically. Emerging market bonds, which are bonds from, I hate this phrase, but third world countries that are growing really fast, and those bonds can pay 4, maybe 5% a yield, which is getting kind of high, but they're not subject to the interest rate risks that we've talked about before in the United States. And then a skosh of your portfolio, probably no more than 5% of your total in high yield, also known as junk bonds. And sometimes they make a great return. For the last 12 months, they returned 11%. So if you're in retirement and you have something like that where the high yield bonds make 11% and the stock market didn't happen to also be up, which it was up smartly for the last 12 months, there's a place where you could take out more money. You don't have to take it out of the stocks, but if you get a year like, 2012, 2013, where the market went up 32%, well, that's where you want to take out money to fund your retirement. You want to take out high. You want to sell high. You buy low, you sell high. It's such simple logic, but it's so hard to actually do. So that's some about the cushion and how it works. Hopefully that helped explain to the multitude of listeners who asked about me giving more information about the cushion. And then our next thing is about 401ks and possible changes in the rules. Many years ago, the U.S. government created a little rule in the law. It's called the 401k. At least that's what we call it today. And it allows you to put money from your paycheck, from your employer, directly into the 401k account. And when you do that, up to $18,000 or $24,000 if you're over the age of 50, you don't have to pay tax on that money. And that money gets to grow and compound tax deferred when you do take the money out, and you are compelled by law to start taking money out at the age of 70 and one half. So for a lot of people, that's a long time away. And unfortunately for the government, they are now seeing people putting a generous amount of their money into 401ks and not paying tax on the money now. Now, of course, in the future, they'll pay tax on that. And in the end, the government will get plenty of money. But with like anything that the government does, they can, with a simple vote, change the rules. And we are now at a time period where people might vote to change those rules, which is very disconcerting, very upsetting, and it creates potentially instability in the system, and that's not good for anybody. But one of the ideas that has been floated around is that the government would require all 401ks effective on a certain date. Now, keep in mind, this is just a proposal. Trump may or may not support it, but he's the only guy that can veto it. So if Congress passes this, it could become the law, and I would assume it would start at the beginning of a calendar year and not be retroactive. But if they pass this and make all 401ks Roth 401ks, which actually is not too horribly bad for the average investor, because while you do have to pay taxes now, no matter how much it grows, you don't pay taxes in the future. If tax rates are the same today as they are in the future, in the end, the result is the same. Unfortunately for you, in the short term, you don't get a tax deduction, which means you pay more in taxes, which is the fucking point of them changing this rule. So if you're saving 20 grand a year in your 401k and not paying tax on it, the government will now get the tax on that. So if your tax bracket is 25% and you save 20 grand, they're going to collect $5,000 in taxes from you, which of course makes it a little bit harder for you to put $20,000 away if you have to pay $5,000 in taxes. But it can create an immense windfall for the U.S. government, a lot more tax revenue, and this has been proposed as one of the ways to offset the reduction of tax rates for the wealthy. Now, the wealthy, people who make $400,000 or $500,000, millions of dollars a year, they will generally max out their 401k if they have one, and they're going to have to pay a little bit more in tax. But if they pay $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 more in tax on money they put into the 401k, it's offset by the fact that their tax rates went down 10%. They're not going to complain about this. They're not going to have a problem with this. Who this is going to affect are the people who make $50,000, $80,000, $100,000, $200,000, maybe even $300,000 a year, who aren't going to get much of a discount in their taxes, but are going to have to pay tax on all the money that goes into their Roth. Now, again, if you expect to make more money in the future, if you expect tax rates to be higher in the future, you probably actually want a Roth, but they're not doing it to help you out. And the unfortunate thing is that if they charge all the tax up front from all the people putting money in 401ks, that means 10, 15, 20 years down the road, when everyone takes money out, there again will be a tax shortage problem. So when people take money out of IRAs today, they get taxed. So that creates a source of revenue. If it's all in Roth IRAs, no matter how big your portfolio grows under current law, no matter how big your portfolio grows, whatever you take out, you pay no tax. And so that creates a future problem for tax revenue for the federal government. But that's 10, 20, 30 years down the road. The current Congress doesn't seem to care about what's going to happen in the future. If they can create a way to reward the wealthy, create a penalty that can be explained away to lower income workers or average Americans, and bring in more revenue, or at least net revenue neutral in the short run, they don't seem to care. So I think people should be able to choose, and everyone should have the option to choose an IRA, traditional IRA or a Roth IRA on their own. They shouldn't be compelled to switch to a Roth. I hopefully that they don't make you switch your current accounts to a Roth, because that would create a huge tax bill. But my fear is that at some point in the future, they could vote again, simple by vote, and say, oh, all that money you have in a Roth IRA, you now do have to pay tax on it. And people say, well, they can't do that. Well, of course they can. They can change the rule at any time they want to. They just vote, and the rule changes. Social Security, when it was originally paid out, was not taxable. Today, up to 85% of it is taxable. So it's just a vote. They vote to change it. That's why your vote counts. You want to vote for people that want to put and promote your agenda, things that you want. I happen to think that people that make wildly more money than the average person should pay higher taxes, not lower taxes. And one of the neat ways around that today is that if you make the vast majority of your income from stock appreciation, you are going to pay 15 or a top rate of 20% tax. It's called long-term capital gains tax rates. They used to be much, much higher. It used to be 28%. It used to be that you had to hold something for 5 years. And they keep shortening the term and they keep lowering the rates. So if you are already wealthy and don't work for a living, I got my little air quotes up, you don't do physical labor for a living, but you manage your money, if you make $100,000 from your money, your tax rate might be 15 or 20%. If you make $100,000 working through physical labor, it might be 25 or 28%. So the really wealthy, again, get a tax discount. And that might be slightly worse for some people if they're forced to use Roth 401ks all of the time. So anyway, enough discussion about that. And we're going to take a little break and get on to our interviews.
My name is Annie Drian, and I'm founder of Cosmos Studios and an honored to have been the longtime collaborator of Carl Sagan. And I'd like to say that I think it's just the opposite of what you're saying from my perspective, humbly. One is that I think that science tolerates the unknown in a way that religion doesn't. My argument is not with people who search for God. My argument is with people who feel that our understanding of God is completed. And those are the people who make so much of our existence on this planet such a hell, because they really think that they have the right to kill other people, to hurt them, because of what they understand God's will to be. That's a very destructive thing. So science is, the whole methodology of science is saying that we are not permitted these absolute truths that religion pretends to have, that we do not know the answer to these questions. And not only that, but the little that we think we do know, if you can prove us wrong, we'll give you our highest reward. And that's part of the methodology. That's part of the whole functioning of the system itself. So yes, in answer to what Joan was saying earlier, scientists do terrible things. Scientists have biases. Religious people do terrible things, and they have biases. But absolutely intrinsic to the whole the methodology of science is that error-correcting mechanism, which says we must never lose sight of that. That's not in religion. That's not present at all. Talk about humble. It's the fact that we do science and that we can bring ourselves to see that little tiny earth in Carolyn's presentation. That is humility. What science has done for us spiritually is that it has been the only thing that I know of that has compelled us to wean ourselves of our infantile need for centrality. And that was present, that is very much the essence of so many religious formulations of where we come from, why we came to be. It's the sign of mental health, that we can bear to think that this planet was perfectly fine for 4.5 billion years without us. That cosmic evolution goes on for 13.5 billion years before we even get here. How long have we been in science? How long have we systematically been looking at nature? Not even 400 years. And yet science gets us out to Enceladus. It takes us out of the solar system. It enables us to wean ourselves of that spiritual narcissism which compelled us to be at the center of everything. So when it comes to humility, when it comes to a tolerance for ambiguity and for the unknown, I think science worships the unknown. I think scientists are most comfortable in that place of not knowing. And that's where they live. And that's the great strength of science. So I would respectfully disagree.
All right, everybody, welcome back. You are still listening to the Phil Ferguson Show, and this, of course, is Phil Ferguson. My interview now is with a guest who's been on, but it's been a while, so I'm delighted to have him back. It is Gleb Tsipursky. And I tried not to say that in Italian. What is that? Is that a Russian name?
Yes, it's Russian. It's Eastern European, but yes,
it looked
Russian.
It looked somewhere between Russia and Poland, but I wasn't quite sure how to go with it. But thank you for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back with you, Phil.
And before we get into the project that you want to talk about, which is the Rational Politics Project, why don't you give the listeners a little background of what is your background, your history. What put you in a position to talk about this?
Sure. So my background is that I'm a professor in the history of behavioral sciences at Ohio State, and I research decision-making and social and emotional intelligence. So that's kind of my research background. About 3 years ago, I founded a nonprofit called Intentional Insights to popularize decision-making and social and emotional intelligence to a broad audience. And I wrote some books about this, wrote books such as Find Your Purpose Using Science and other books. I publish frequently in high-profile venues like Time, New York Daily News, Salon, The Conversation, Psychology Today, Huffington Post. I appear frequently on radio, TV, podcasts, videocasts, and so on. So that is what gives me the credibility to talk about this.
Yeah, so this is not something you just thought of last week. I mean, you've been working on this area for a while.
Yep, and I'm a well-known person in this area. People can go to, if they want to check out more about me, they can go to my website, which is glebtsipursky.com, GLEBTSIPURSKY.com, and they can find out more about me.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about the Rational Politics. What's that all about?
So with Intentional Insights, we've been doing a whole bunch of stuff in a variety of areas. Last time I talked about wise financial decision-making in that sector. So that's one of the areas of work. How do we make decisions in finances? But ever since this campaign season, this election season, we've been seeing that people are making really bad decisions in politics, and really harmful ones, harmful for themselves, harmful for our country, harmful for their interests. So we focused much of our efforts right now at Intentional Insights, which is at intentionalinsights.org, on helping fix the really problematic situation in our politics, which has been filled with irrationality recently. So for Oxford Dictionary has chosen the word post-truth politics for its word of the year in 2016 to indicate politics that has come to prominence recently, which is politics characterized by appeals to emotion and personal beliefs over facts. And that's because of the political situation in the 2016 presidential election in the US and the situation around Brexit in the UK. So because of those two reasons, mainly because of the US. So this is highly problematic. And since the goal of Intentional Insights is to address the irrationality in our world in general, we are focusing much of our energy on this area.
Well, that's nice. Now, how do you get to rational politics? I mean, I don't think very many of my listeners are going to disagree that the last election was largely irrational, but how do we fix it?
Right. There are a lot of strategies, and we have we're doing a number of things. One is about how to actually change people's minds effectively. People, or your listeners, people who are like me, who are oriented toward truth and reason. We've done some behavioral science research on this, and lo and behold, they are not talking very effectively to people who aren't oriented toward truth and reason. So when people who are oriented toward truth and reason meet each other, they use debate-style tactics to try to convince other people like them, which works really well when you're talking to people who care about truth and reason. Doesn't work well when you talk about the large majority of Americans, let's say, not the vast majority, large majority of Americans who don't have nearly as much concern for truth and reason as the typical listener of this show. So we've been working on researching how do you actually convince people who aren't already oriented toward truth and reason to care about truth and reason. So that's one area of our work. Another area of our work is how do you create incentives for politicians, for public figures, to avoid lying and to tell more of the truth. Because one thing is, what you can do as an individual to have healthy conversations, which is really important. Another is, how do you get politicians to stop lying and stop deceiving? And that's why we created and we have evaluated this from the perspective of behavioral science. So how our minds actually work, how people do things, why people do things. And we figured out that the main problem here is incentives. They lack incentives to tell the truth, and they have a lot of incentives to lie, because if they lie and they can convince people through lies and deceptions, then they can get those people to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise, that goes against their own interests, the people's own interests. So we have created what we call the Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org, which I encourage all of your listeners to go to and sign as a way of creating a mass movement that would get politicians and other public figures to change their perspectives and to lie less and tell the truth more.
We have to encourage people to lie less. That is truly staggering. Now, is some politician going to actually go and pledge? Is that what the plan is? Is it going to work? Is someone going to do it?
Oh, we already have politicians who do it.
What?
And you know why they do it? Yes. You're surprised.
I kind of am, because I'm trying. I get the need, the desire for the voters, but what is the need for the politician? Walk me through that, and who is on there?
Sure. So if you go to the protruthpledge.org, and if you or your listeners go to it, you can go to the third FAQ question, which is, what are the rewards for taking the pledge if you're an elected or appointed public official? Now, voters know that politicians often lie. The level of credibility for politicians is not very high. So it's important for politicians to be perceived as trustworthy. And this is all about perceptions. So we've done some research on why do politicians lie? And politicians lie because that helps them get their agenda across. Now, what happens when politicians lie is that they undermine the common trust that we have in our political system when they're discovered to lie. It undermines the trust, it undermines the credibility of the political system, and essentially pollutes truth in our politics. So it burns this credibility, this trust. And it's harmful for everyone, for all of us, for politicians to lie. But it's beneficial to individual politicians to lie because if other politicians are going to lie, well, they can just as well lie and get the benefits of lying. So there are some politicians who would like it for other politicians to not lie, but for that to be the case, they need a reputation as trustworthy politicians. So they need to be perceived as trustworthy. And so the Pro-Truth Pledge allows them to be perceived as trustworthy because there's a monitoring mechanism, a pretty strict monitoring mechanism, where if a public figure, such as a politician, or myself, I'm a public figure, I go on podcasts and talk about podcasts, or you yourself, Phil, you're a public figure, you talk to people, you talk about your podcast, you make an impact on the public sphere. So anyone who's a public figure who makes an impact on the public sphere, when they go and they sign the pledge, they have an opportunity to provide information about why they signed the pledge and what are their online venues, Twitter, so on, Facebook, their website. And so we have a group of volunteers, anyone, a private citizen, not simply a public figure, who signs the pledge. So we want as many people as possible to sign the pledge, have opportunities to sign up for updates from the pledge, and sign up to be an advocate for the pledge, to help with the pledge. Of those people who sign up to help with the pledge, some of them are asked to be volunteers who monitor people like politicians or like you or like me who sign the pledge. And so their role is to look and see if people who are public figures who sign the pledge lie. If they lie, there's a significant there's an evaluation mechanism where they're approached by one of the advocates. Let's say, Joe signs the pledge and says that he wants to be an advocate. So private citizen Joe. and the mayor of Chicago, where you live, signs the pledge, and Joe lives in Chicago, and he monitors the mayor of Chicago. If he thinks that the mayor of Chicago lied, he would approach the mayor of Chicago and say, "Hey, I'm concerned about this. Did you misspeak, or what happened there?" So with a really innocent until proven guilty assumption, not saying, "Oh, you're a liar." So just not playing gotcha, just being very kind of calm and saying, "Hey, what's going on here?" If the mayor doesn't respond or kind of waves away Joe, and Joe still thinks the mayor lied, Joe would go to the Chicago Area Monitoring Committee and the Pro-Truth Pledge Monitoring Committee. And this committee evaluates the evidence that Joe presents. And then the committee reaches out to the mayor, and the mayor has an opportunity to defend himself or whatnot. If the mayor still doesn't retract his words, he can retract his words. He can defend and explain the situation. If the mediating committee finds that the mayor lied, and there's a certain process to make sure the mediating committee is not itself messed up, then the mediating committee issues a media advisory to all the media in Chicago area saying that, hey, the mayor of Chicago is now in contempt of the Pro-Truth Pledge, which he signed, and here is evidence that he lied, and he's a liar. So, write the story about him now being in contempt of the Pro-Truth Pledge. And all the people who signed the Pro-Truth Pledge in the Chicago area and who also signed up for Pro-Truth Pledge updates, action alerts, get an action alert saying, tweet to the mayor of Chicago, post Facebook posts tagging him, email him, and write letters to the editor about the mayor of Chicago being a liar. And in this situation, and him violating and being in contempt of the Pro-Truth Pledge. So at that stage, the mayor gets a really pretty sizable reputational hit for not taking back his words. So he can have a number of opportunities to take back his words. I can misspeak and you can misspeak, Phil, without a deliberate intent to deceive. And then if somebody alerts us, we'll take back our words. If the mayor of Chicago doesn't take back his words, then that's the problem. It's a clear intent, deliberate intent to deceive, and that's what contempt of the pledge involves. So if the mayor of Chicago intends to deceive when taking the pledge, he's better off not taking the pledge in the first place.
Yeah, so I can see how that would be really annoying. And I don't know if I want to use shaming, but there's now some weight behind it, and there's a system. But what makes it not a Republican versus Democrat thing?
Oh, well, both Republicans and Democrats are welcome to take the pledge, and we want as many as Democrats as Republicans to take the pledge. We actually have an approach of when we approach a candidate to take the pledge, we try to make sure to approach all candidates who are running for a certain race to take the pledge. So, for example, here in Ohio, where I'm based, we have approached some candidates. We've approached Senator Rob Portman, who is the senator of Ohio, to take the pledge. He's a Republican senator. We've also approached the Democratic senator, Sherrod Brown, to take the pledge. And we're also approaching Rob Portman's Democratic opponents and Sherrod Brown's Republican opponents for them to take the pledge. So we are giving all people who are in a certain race the opportunity to take the pledge, and we're not only approaching one or the other. So let's say in Chicago, we'd approach the mayor, and we'd approach any of the opponents who want to run against him, including not simply Republican or Democrat, but also if there's independent candidates, like let's say the Green Party or something like that, Libertarian Party, would approach them as well.
And when do we get to a presidential debate up on stage where two or three people haven't taken the pledge and they get embarrassed for it? When does that happen?
That happens in 2020. So yes, this is one of the things we do want to bring about, where if an opponent, so for example, I'll give you an example. Here in Ohio, we have several candidates for Ohio District 12 who have taken the pledge, the Pro-Truth Pledge. So they're Democratic candidates running against a Republican congressperson. and he's up for election in 2018. So we're approaching them. They took the pledge. We're approaching the Republican, Tiberi, that's his name, and Pat Tiberi. And he will have the opportunity to take the pledge. If he chooses not to take the pledge after we approach him several times, and after the Democratic candidates took the pledge, we'll go to the media and say, hey, here's the situation. The Democratic candidates have chosen to take the pledge, and the Republican candidate has, hopefully he'll also take the pledge. And we'll say, he has also taken the pledge. So let's write a media story, media people, about all of them being oriented toward honesty. Now, if the Republican candidate chooses not to take the pledge, we'll also take that to the media and say, hey, the Democratic candidates have chosen to take the pledge, and the Republican candidate has not taken the pledge. That's also a story. And the same thing would be the case if we have Republican candidates who took the pledge and a Democratic, office holder who has not taken the pledge. It's not about partisanship. It's about just people who are oriented toward the pledge. And now we have a certain penalizing mechanism and a monitoring mechanism for evaluating whether they're oriented toward truth and honesty.
Well, I like the idea of it, but part of me is worried that a large part of the electorate base really just doesn't care. Because there are people, and I don't want to pick on just President Trump, but there are people who just come out and say things that are blatantly true, and there already are stories about it being not true, but it's not covered in the media that is consumed by the people that support that candidate. How do you get into a different media?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and I have to say I have had some success of getting into conservative media. So one of the biggest conservative names here is Scott Sloan in the Ohio area. And he is on 700 WLW. He is a conservative radio talk show host. He has had President Trump on his radio show shortly before I went on. And he was glad to have me on. We talked about Islam and terrorism and how that's what that kind of issue is. And naturally, as a conservative, he was critical of Muslims and kind of terrorism. And we had a very healthy conversation at the end of which he agreed that despite feelings of fear and anger toward Muslims that we may experience, we still should be nice toward them and not persecute them contra Donald Trump. So we can have those conversations and we can get into that media. A lot of people care about the truth. This is a nonpartisan pledge, and a lot of people are going to be willing to sign the pledge and push their Congress people and so on to sign the pledge. This is why it's really important to make sure to have all people sign the pledge and to approach both candidates in the race when they want to sign the pledge. We're also going to approach people like Scott Sloan and tell Scott Sloan, hey, Scott Sloan, would you be willing to sign this pledge? Now, if Scott Sloan is willing to sign the pledge, he's going to share about it on his radio show. And then some people who are in his base will sign the pledge, and that will be getting the message out to conservatives. The same way if I go to a liberal talk show host and get a liberal talk show host to sign the pledge while on air and something like that.
Now, is there something on the website that tells me who has already agreed to the pledge and where they are?
We're building out that part,
okay.
But yes, that part will definitely be built out. Another benefit for people who sign the pledge, let's say, you sign the pledge, then you have an opportunity to share a paragraph about why you signed the pledge and your contact information and your podcast and so on. Now, that gets sent out in a bi-monthly, twice-a-month newsletter to all the people who signed the Pro-Truth Pledge and indicated they want to receive updates from it. So that builds up credibility for you and any other radio talk show host, podcast host, and so on, reporter who signed the Pro-Truth Pledge, and hurts their opponents, their competitors in the media, because, well, if you have signed the Pro-Truth Pledge and you're going to be monitored and evaluated, people will trust more what's coming from your mouth than they would trust somebody who didn't sign the Pro-Truth Pledge. And so that gets you more of a share of their attention. And so that's another reason that not simply politicians would sign the pledge, but podcast hosts and reporters and so on, and Scott Sloan, conservative and liberal alike, would be interested in signing the pledge. And this is why we looked at the behavioral science aspects of it and creating incentives, rewards, and punishments. So there are clear rewards for signing the pledge, as well as clear punishments.
Now, one of the questions that I guess I kind of have to ask, given my business, who's paying for all this?
Oh, this is run by Intentional Insights, the nonprofit that I lead, which is, we are always welcome donations at intentionalinsights.org/donate. And this is what's behind it. It's all donations because there are a number of people in the United States who care about the truth, and they want there to be the truth in our country. And this is a mechanism to get our public sphere to be more oriented toward truth and less oriented toward post-truth, which unfortunately is where it's at right now. So in order to fix our system, what the research on behavioral science shows is that we need a new social contract. We need new social contract mechanisms, and the pro-truth pledge is one way of getting there. So giving people incentives, getting them to sign a contract where they're contractually obligated to orient toward the truth, and they get certain punishments for not doing it and certain rewards for doing so.
Well, it all sounds very nice. I hope it works.
Me too.
It's one of those things that I know that there's another group called Science Debate that started for 2008, I think it was, that wanted national level politicians to debate science because science is so critically important, and so far it's not really happened. And maybe this is easier because you don't have to get both parties to agree to a debate. You just have to get one person to agree to say, I'm going to be truthful, and the other person then looks bad for not, why wouldn't you just say that you're going to be truthful?
Exactly.
So that part of the engineering, that part of the design I like. But then I do wonder still, when someone comes back and says, you weren't truthful, and the person says, yes, I was. I did see the video footage of people celebrating across the bay in New Jersey when the Twin Towers came down. Is it an opinion? Is it wrong? Or is it not truthful? I mean...
Wonderful question. So that relates to question that's in the first question of the FAQ. What is considered misinformation? And the first part of what's considered misinformation is a blatant lie. Something like 2 + 2 = 3, or, I didn't have sex with that woman, where it's like, okay, no, that you're not going to go there. That's, definition of sex is wrong. Bill Clinton. So you did have sex with that woman. Don't lie to us. So that's a clear lie. We can start with those. Now, there are two other things besides clear lies that we use as what's considered misinformation. One is reliable fact-checking websites. And reliable fact-checking websites, before you ask, we outsource the job of evaluating what are reliable fact-checking websites to Facebook. Facebook has a strong incentive with its new fake news checking program to use only the most reliable websites. It has a big financial incentive to make sure that neither conservatives nor liberals dislike it. So it has partnered with 4 websites to use that, and we're using the same websites. We just outsource that job to Facebook. So if a politician happens to disagree with one of those websites, that politician will be considered lying. And also the case for, a talk show host or a scholar, a scientist, a scientist who's a public figure, and so on. They will be considered lying if they disagree with one of the 4 reliable fact-checking websites. The last criterion is science. So science is the best way we as human beings have of discovering the truth about the physical reality of the world. So this is not about metaphysical stuff. This is just the physical reality of the world. So on issues where there's a scientific consensus, there's a clear scientific consensus, we use that as a reliable indicator of truth. So let's say somebody who says that vaccines cause autism. That would be a violation of the pro-truth pledge. Or someone who says, humans have not caused global climate change, have not contributed, human actions have not contributed in a significant way to global climate change, that would be a violation of the pro-truth pledge, because there's a clear scientific consensus that human actions that can significantly contribute to global climate change. So either of those things would be a violation of the pro-truth pledge. So we have clear definitions of what violates the pro-truth pledge.
And the next thing you're going to say is that smoking doesn't cause cancer would be a violation of the pro-truth pledge.
Oh, it would be absolutely a violation of the pro-truth pledge.
Well,
there's an established, credible science, a scientific consensus that smoking causes cancer. Yes.
I mean, there's some things that are political positions, and some people want one thing versus another. But there are some things, like you said, that are science-based, and there's actual evidence. And so far, some politicians seem to be pretty free and loose to say things that are just very easily verifiably not true, and there's no checking. The one that amazes me almost every week is Sean Spicer, and I did a breakdown the very first time he had a press conference when he just came out and read a little speech. I went through that line by line by line and found out that 60 to 75% of everything he said was an easily verifiable untruth.
I hear you.
But yet, I had friends who are conservatives who heard his same speech and said things like, "Finally, someone is getting up and speaking the truth."
Yeah, I hear that. I think here is where we want to be careful with the terminology of verifiable. If we have reliable fact-checking websites verifying that something that Sean Spicer said is untrue, then, and if he signed the pro-truth pledge, he'd be in violation of it, and unless he retracts his words, he'd be in contempt of it. And let me be clear, violation is like a minor thing. It's like a traffic violation. Oh, you violated the pro-truth pledge, you made a mistake, retract your words, and we're all good. So if someone refuses to retract their words, that's where we consider it a deliberate deception.
And that's the nice thing about the checks and balances that appear to be built into the system. So it's not just, hey, Phil Ferguson said that you're a liar. It's a system, and there's an opportunity for them to respond, and it can be elevated, and it finally gets to a point where it becomes, hopefully, a newsworthy item. And if that happens often enough, perhaps, if we can swing 4 or 5 or, I can dream 10% of the population to start caring, it would make a difference.
Absolutely. And if we can swing influencers to start caring, that would also make a difference. So this is why we are targeting people who are not simply politicians, but also people who provide influence on the media. So media figures and so on, to get them to start caring and watching their words. So Sean Spicer is not technically a politician. He's an appointed official, but we'd like him to sign the pledge, that would be nice. Or other people who are in the administration to sign the pledge. Anyone who actually impacts the media, commentators, analysts on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, to sign the pro-truth pledge and orient toward it and be able to provide evidence for their words or retract their words if they're not able to provide evidence for it.
Because I'm looking at the website, and of course it's got the politicians you just mentioned, media figures, scientists, organizational leaders, and just individual private citizens. And I look forward to having some races won by a point or two, because one person said that they're going to stand up and allow themselves to be corrected by reality, and the other person won't take the pledge and therefore looks lesser in the eyes of some voters. That would be fantastic. Is there anything about this in general we haven't covered yet?
No, I think that's good. I think for people who want to be advocates, so that's the third to last point, people can do things. If they want to help with the pledge, they can do organizing, so organizing other people to coordinate them in organizing the pledge. They can do public promotion, which is going to various events and getting people to sign the pledge by political rallies, Republican or Democratic clubs, secular group events, church group events, whatever, all sorts of events. they can do lobbying for individual officials to sign the pledge. We had actually some quite successful lobbying where one of our activists went to the Facebook pages of local congressional delegates, of people who are running for Congress, and asked if they would be willing to sign the pledge, and he got some immediate yeses. So that was great. And other forms of lobbying and so on, or doing monitoring and evaluation of politicians and other public figures who signed the pledge.
And of course,
so those are things that people can do.
The website is protruthpledge.org. Mm-hmm. And how can people reach you if they have questions for you?
They can reach me at gleb@intentionalinsights.org. That's my email. Again, gleb, Gleb, @intentionalinsights.org. And I want to check with you, Phil. Do you think you'd be comfortable signing the Pro-Truth Pledge?
I figured there was a hook at the end of this somewhere.
There was.
There was. I'll of course, I'll have to hedge my bets and say I think so, but I want to look at all the details.
Excellent.
Great.
Look forward to talking about it.
Well, Gleb, thank you so much for being on the Phil Ferguson Show, and I greatly appreciate the work that you're doing to try to make the world a better place.
Thank you so much, Phil. Really appreciate you having me.
Have a good day.
You too.
I like how you call homosexuality an abomination.
I don't say homosexuality is an abomination, Mr. President. The Bible does.
Yes, it does. Leviticus
18:22.
Chapter and verse. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions while I had you here. I'm interested in selling my youngest daughter into slavery, as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. She's a Georgetown sophomore, speaks fluent Italian, always cleared the table when it was her turn. What would a good price for her be? While thinking about that, can I ask another? My chief of staff, Leo McGarry, insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly says he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or is it okay to call the police? Here's one that's really important, because we've got a lot of sports fans in this town. Touching the skin of a dead pig makes one unclean, Leviticus 11:7. If they promise to wear gloves, can the Washington Redskins still play football? Can Notre Dame? Can West Point? Does the whole town really have to be together to stone my brother John for planting different crops side by side? Can I burn my mother in a small family gathering for wearing garments made from two different threads? Think about those questions, would you? One last thing. Well, you may be mistaking this for your monthly meeting of the Ignorant Tight-Ass Club. In this building, when the president stands, nobody sits.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Of course, it's that time of the show where we get to wrap things up. Next week, we are going to have on Thomas True. He's going to tell us about the convention coming up this summer in St. Louis. And I want to remind everybody that, yes, this was the convention that canceled last year. However, the lineup is amazing, and Thomas True was able to locate someone that I happen to know, so I can vouch for them, although they want to remain anonymous, that is underwriting the conference. And no, it is not me, but it is someone who has the funds to do it. So this conference is going to happen no matter what. So you can rest assured that your ticket purchase and registration for a room is going to be a good investment. Well invested? I don't know, good investment. So hopefully I can see you there, because that will kind of be the end to my little convention hiatus while I've been moving. Speaking of moving, we took possession of the new house in the extreme southwest suburbs of Chicago. So I look forward to playing around a little bit more in Chicago and the Chicago suburbs. So if you're in the area, feel free to say hey. Send me a message on Facebook or something if you run a group or have any good suggestions at where I can go. I went and found a couple of Italian grocery store / delis, and so I think I found a few people to speak Italian with, and I've got to find some kind of community group up there to go join and hang out with people, so that'll be great fun. Did get a couple new reviews on iTunes. One is from John in P-Town. This is such a great podcast. Not only does Phil break down investing, but he's got top-notch guests. But best of all is Phil. Oh, how sweet. He's such a great host and such an asset to the atheist movement. Easily in my top 2 podcasts. Top 2? What the hell? No, I'm very, very happy. Actually, if you're in your top 5, I'd be really, really happy. So thank you for that. And then another podcast review on iTunes by Skeptically Yours. The title of the comment is 3/3 Excellent Content. And that, I think that's in reference, I hope it's in reference to 1/3 finance, 2/3 atheism. And then they go on and they add, do not take listening advice from a podcast review. That is sweet. I like that. Very, very clever. Every once in a while, I'll throw out the phrase, don't take investing advice from a podcast. I mean, it's hopefully entertaining, hopefully educational. Of course, you should do your own diligence and check into things before you spend any money. And you can always take time, just like I did during our interview today, to say, let me think about it. It's a nice life lesson to try not to do anything because of social pressure, normative pressure, something that comes up and it's a limited time. There's always other investments. You have your entire life to invest. If you ever end up sitting down with somebody that tells you have to do this now or it's going to go away, you should just go away. There will be other investments. Don't panic. You'll have lots and lots of time. So that is going to wrap up our show, and I'm going to go and pack a few more boxes. We're going to take another load or 2 before the movers come, and then the big move. So there might be another little bit of a delay. My apologies between now and the next podcast. It probably will not happen within the next 7 days. I'm hoping 10. But we're going to talk to Thomas True. And then after that, we're probably going to have an interview with 1 or 2 people from recovering from religion and all of the great work that they are doing. So once again, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you at a conference soon. Ciao.